I never thought a forest lookout tower would be my sanctuary. Yet here I am, perched 30 feet above the ground, watching the world burn in slow motion. The wind whistles through the trees, carrying the distant groans of the infected, and for the first time in months, I feel safer. Not safe, there's a difference, but safer. Safer is the closest thing to peace a man can hope for in the apocalypse. I found this tower by accident. I'd been scavenging along the remnants of Highway 47 when the sun dipped below the horizon, turning the sky into a bleeding canvas of orange and purple. My car was long gone, stripped down to its skeleton by looters or the careless undead. My stomach growled from 2 days without food, and every instinct screamed at me to find shelter. That's when I saw it. A rusted ladder protruding from the tree line, like a crooked finger pointing toward salvation. The climb was terrifying. Every step groaned under my weight, and I imagined the ladder snapping beneath me, sending me into the waiting jaws of whatever lurked below. My lungs burned. My hands were raw, and yet I reached the top, and when I did, I realized I'd stumbled onto a fortress. From this height, I could see the forest stretch endlessly in every direction, broken only by the occasional flicker of movement, probably a scavenger, maybe worse. I didn't have much. A backpack with a few cans of beans, a half-empty water bottle, and a baseball bat I'd sharpened into a crude spear. But up here, with the sun setting and the shadows growing long, I felt like I could breathe. The first night was the hardest. I rigged the door to the ladder with a piece of rope as a rudimentary lock, though I knew it wouldn't stop anyone determined. I listened to the groans outside, a symphony of horror that I couldn't quite shut out. Sleep was impossible. The fear clung to me like a second skin. And then I realized, if I was going to survive, I needed routines, plans, rules. Fear could keep me alive, but only discipline would let me endure. Morning brought a fragile hope. I scavenged the perimeter, marking trails and identifying sources of water. There was a small stream about half a mile east, winding through the trees like a silver snake. That would be my lifeline. I also spotted a ruined cabin, likely picked clean, but possibly with something useful. My scavenging trips would be timed and cautious. Down here, I was invisible. Up there, I was king of a kingdom no one wanted. By day 3, I began to notice patterns. The infected were slow, lumbering in the dense forest, but they were persistent. One misstep and I'd be trapped, but if I moved carefully, I could avoid them. I found an abandoned hunter's cache, a half-broken rifle with a few bullets, a hunting knife, and a stack of rope. Not enough to feel invincible, but enough to survive. I made the tower livable over the next few weeks. I scavenged planks and nails, patching the ladder, reinforcing the walls, and setting up a pulley system for supplies. I even managed a crude shower system using an old barrel and the morning dew. Small comforts, I told myself, but they kept me sane. The forest was relentless, and sanity was the most fragile thing I had left. I started talking to myself, laughing at my own jokes, arguing over decisions, pretending the empty tower had company. It was either that or give in to despair. I named the tower Haven, a joke, a prayer, a warning. Haven was everything and nothing. The name reminded me that survival wasn't about heroics, it was about persistence, cleverness, and a touch of stubbornness. Weeks passed. I could see the seasons changing from my perch, the way the light shifted in the mornings, how the leaves turned, fell, and returned. I became adept at spotting danger, a snapped branch, a shadow where there shouldn't be one, the low, guttural groan of a zombie moving through underbrush. I even rigged simple alarms, tin cans strung on thin wire, A rudimentary but effective warning system. Then, one afternoon, I saw it. Movement I hadn't anticipated. Another human, a man, ragged, stumbling, with eyes wild and desperate. He didn't notice me at first, and I froze, unsure whether to shout or hide. My heart hammered in my chest as I weighed the risks, and strangers were dangerous. Some would trade, some would kill, some would be worse. But I also hadn't spoken to another person in weeks. I decided to wait, to watch. The man's desperation was evident. He had a makeshift spear, the kind you sharpen when you have nothing else. He wasn't attacking the zombies, he was running from them. But his luck ran out. A small group of infected rounded the trees, drawn to his scent, and I could see him falter, panic overtaking him. Something inside me stirred. Fear, yes, but also a memory of my brother, of friends lost, of the days before the world ended. I couldn't just watch. I grabbed my rifle and aimed, careful to make every shot count. 2 shots, precise, and the nearest zombies fell. The man looked up, terrified, and I gestured for him to stay quiet. When he finally made it to the base of the tower, I helped him climb. His arms were shaking. He was soaked in sweat and blood, though not all his own. I didn't ask questions. I knew better. I thought I was done for, he said, gasping. His voice cracked. You saved me. Don't thank me yet, I replied, my own voice rough. You get in. You stay quiet. You follow my rules. You survive. He nodded, too exhausted to argue. I hoisted him up the final rung, and for a moment, we simply breathed, listening to the forest and the distant groans. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't alone, and for the first time, I realized that survival wasn't just about food or fortifications or rifles. Survival was about decisions, the small ones, the daily ones, and the bigger ones, like whether to trust another human when the world had proven them deadly. I didn't know if I had made the right choice. But from up here, in Haven, I had time. Time to think, time to watch, time to prepare. And in the apocalypse, time was the rarest luxury of all. The stranger didn't introduce himself. I didn't ask. Names had a way of making people real, and in the apocalypse, reality was dangerous. All that mattered was survival, and he had to prove he could follow the rules. Rule number 1, no wandering. The forest was a hunting ground, and any careless step could draw attention. Rule number 2, silence. The undead can hear more than you think, and sound travels farther than you imagine. Rule number 3, no stealing. Everything up here was earned or scavenged. There was no room for betrayal. For the next few days, we settled into a cautious routine. I scavenged the stream for water and the surrounding woods for food berries, roots, the occasional small animal. He helped with hauling supplies and keeping lookout. He was surprisingly capable for someone who looked like he hadn't eaten a proper meal in weeks. Every so often, I caught him staring out across the treetops, as if measuring some invisible horizon. I wondered if he was thinking of family, or if he was simply imagining the world before it ended. I started calling him Mick, after a stray comment he made about a bar he used to frequent. He didn't correct me, and in the strange way that silence works, it became a name. Mick had a fire about him, a nervous energy that reminded me of myself before everything went wrong. He asked questions about my routine, about the tower, about the best ways to avoid the infected. I answered sparingly, testing his judgment, watching how he handled information. And then the first real threat arrived. I was scanning the forest from the upper platform when I spotted a movement too deliberate to be the usual wandering horde. A group of humans, maybe 4 or 5, cautiously making their way through the trees. They were armed, And not just with scavenged knives or spears. They had rifles, the kind that could reach across the valley. They weren't here by accident. Human, I muttered under my breath, gripping my rifle tighter. Mick came up beside me, and I could see the same fear mirrored in his eyes. They're not infected, he whispered, but they're looking aggressive. Could be looters, I said, or worse. Could be a gang. Could be smart enough to know a tower's defensible, but not smart enough to leave it alone. We watched them for hours, moving in and out of cover, never leaving the tree line, always observing, calculating. I knew they'd eventually find the path to our base. It was only a matter of time. That night, I fortified the tower as best I could. Planks across the ladder, rope traps at the base, even a few noisemakers I had strung from branches to give us an early warning. Mick followed my instructions without question, carrying heavy loads, moving quietly, his eyes sharp and alert. For the first time, I felt like this tower wasn't just my sanctuary. It was ours. The intruders arrived just as dawn cracked the horizon. I could hear the snapping of twigs, low voices calling out, testing the air. I pressed my back against the wall, listening. One of them laughed, a hollow sound that made my stomach turn. "They're trying to lure us out," I whispered. "Don't move." Mick nodded, though I could tell his hands were trembling. I loaded my rifle, sighting the nearest figure. My heart was pounding, and I knew any misstep could end both our lives. Then it happened. One of them spotted the traps at the base and shouted. The sound echoed across the clearing. The group stopped, hesitated, then began circling the tower, rifles raised. They weren't here to negotiate, they were here to conquer. I aimed at the nearest one, and Mick did the same. We fired simultaneously. 2 went down, but 3 others ducked behind cover, returning fire. Bullets ricocheted off the metal supports of the tower, splintering wood around us. "Stay low!" I shouted, diving behind the railing. Mick scrambled beside me, wide-eyed but determined. The firefight lasted minutes that felt like hours. We had the advantage of height, but they had numbers and precision. The first group I had killed didn't bother me. They were dead, and that was enough. But every shot reminded me of how close death was, how fragile life had become. Eventually, the survivors retreated, dragging their wounded. We didn't cheer. We barely breathed. Both of us knew this wasn't the end. They would return, maybe with reinforcements, maybe with different strategies, but we had bought ourselves time. Time to plan. Time to prepare. After they left, we worked silently, patching the damage, checking traps, cleaning weapons. Mick didn't speak much, but I could see the fire in his eyes had dimmed a little. He had survived, yes, but he'd seen what it could cost. That night, I taught him something more important than any trap or weapon. I showed him how to read the forest, the subtle signs of danger, the way sound carries, how even the wind can tell a story if you know how to listen. I could see him absorbing it all, storing the knowledge, turning fear into a weapon. Weeks passed. The tower became more than a hiding place. It became a fortress. We reinforced the walls, dug shallow pits with sharpened stakes around the base, and built higher platforms for scouting. Mick grew stronger, more confident, more like someone who belonged in this world rather than someone just surviving it. Then came the night of the fire. I was on watch when I smelled it first, the acrid stench of smoke. I rushed to the edge of the platform and saw flames licking the base of the tower. My heart stopped. Someone was trying to burn us out. Panic surged through me, but I forced it down. Mick was already moving, grabbing buckets of water from our supply and hurling them at the flames. I joined him, smothering the fire with blankets and dirt. We worked tirelessly, the smoke choking us, the heat searing our skin. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the flames died, leaving us blackened, coughing, and exhausted. Whoever had tried to burn us out hadn't succeeded, but they had left a message. We weren't safe. We never would be. That night, I lay awake on the platform, staring at the stars. Mick slept fitfully beside me, and I realized something I hadn't admitted before. I had started relying on him, not just for survival, but for companionship, for sanity, and that was dangerous, because the apocalypse has a way of teaching you the hardest lesson last. Trust is the most fragile weapon of all. The forest never sleeps. Even when the tower is silent, even when the wind seems to whisper lullabies, there's always movement, always the faintest echo of something that wants you dead. After the fire, the forest felt different, heavier, charged, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for the next strike. I had hoped the humans who had tried to burn us out were gone, that the message they left was enough to scare them off. I was wrong. It started with small signs, broken branches, footprints, subtle shifts in the underbrush. Then the groans became closer, too close. I realized one night that the horde had started testing the tower. Slowly, cautiously, they circled, always just out of rifle range, always just far enough to keep us from descending for supplies. Mick noticed it too. He'd grown sharper since the fire, alert even in his sleep, listening to the world the way I had taught him. But even he couldn't disguise the fear that flickered across his face when he reported a dozen undead gathered at the base, forming a semicircle, almost like they were waiting. Waiting for what? I didn't know, but instinct told me the answer didn't matter. The tower had to hold. We reinforced the base again, this time with scavenged metal sheets, spikes, and even a crude barricade of logs. Every night we patrolled the perimeter, counting the undead, noting their movements, recording what worked and what didn't. We were prisoners of our own defenses, but at least we were alive. Then came the intruders, the humans, again. They didn't wait this time. They didn't stalk. They charged. A squad of 6, armed with rifles and wearing makeshift armor, attacked just as dawn broke, the forest glowing in pink and orange. Their strategy was simple: overwhelm, and they almost did. Mick and I fired from the top platform, taking out the first 2. But one bullet went wild and struck the railing, splintering it. The railing creaked, and one of the attackers saw the weakness. They moved faster, climbing the ladder with terrifying precision. I grabbed the baseball bat I had sharpened weeks ago, swinging at the first to reach the platform. The blade of the bat caught him across the chest, sending him sprawling over the edge. Mick fired at another, his hands steady despite the adrenaline. But it wasn't enough. One managed to wedge himself into the platform, holding us off. Panic clawed at me, and I realized something terrifying. If we couldn't repel them, the tower would fall. Everything we'd built, every hour of planning, every blood-stained night, it would be gone in seconds. I kicked, I swung, I shoved. Mick joined me, striking with a ferocity I hadn't seen before. And somehow, miraculously, we drove them back, leaving 2 dead at our feet and the rest retreating into the trees. We didn't cheer. We didn't celebrate. We were alive, yes, but only by a thread. I could see it in Mick's eyes: exhaustion, fear, and the dawning realization that survival wasn't just about fighting the undead. Humans were worse. That night, we couldn't sleep. We sat on the platform, watching the forest, counting the groans, the snaps, the distant shouts. Mick finally spoke. "They're going to come back," he said quietly. "And next time, they'll bring more." "I know," I said, "and we'll be ready. We have to be." But the truth was, I didn't know if we would be. I didn't know if a tower, no matter how fortified, could withstand both the dead and the desperate living. Days blurred into nights. We rationed our food, scavenged cautiously, and kept the forest under constant watch. Mick grew bolder, more resourceful. He set traps, patrolled the base, and even managed to scavenge a small generator from an abandoned cabin, giving us light and a crude way to charge radios we hadn't dared use yet. Then, one evening, the real betrayal came. It wasn't from outside the tower. It was from within. Mick had been acting strangely for days, quiet, distant, tense. I had chalked it up to stress, to fear, to survival instinct. But now, as we checked the traps along the base, I saw it. A small, deliberate gap in the barricade. Someone had tampered with it. "Did you do this?" I asked, my voice low. Mick's eyes flicked away, and my stomach sank. I was thinking maybe we could use it," he said softly. "I thought maybe we could lure them into a trap." I felt anger flare, sharp and sudden. "Do you have any idea what you're saying? You could get us both killed." "I know," he whispered. "But if we wait, we die anyway. They're coming back. We can't survive forever up here. Not alone." I didn't answer. I didn't trust him. Not entirely. But I understood the reasoning. He was right. We couldn't survive in isolation forever. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something else. A calculation I hadn't anticipated. A risk I hadn't sanctioned. We fortified again, double-checking the gaps, reinforcing the ladders, and setting up the traps Mick had suggested. It was a tense collaboration, silent except for the occasional grunt or warning. I watched him closely, noting every twitch, every hesitation. I didn't know if I could trust him, but I also knew I had no choice but to rely on him. The night came, and with it, the siege. Not the human attackers this time, but the horde, dozens of undead, drawn perhaps by the earlier gunfire, perhaps by something else we couldn't see. They pressed against the base, groaning and clawing, their numbers swelling with terrifying speed. We fought, we fired, we swung, we used every trap, every plank, every ounce of strength. Mick was relentless, and I was too. But the numbers were overwhelming. One misstep, one missed swing, one moment of hesitation, and we would fall. Then, amidst the chaos, I saw him hesitate. Mick, he stepped aside as an undead hand reached for me, letting it grab my arm for just a moment before I slammed it away. My pulse spiked. Was it a mistake? Was it intentional? I didn't have time to ponder. We were under siege, and survival demanded all our attention. Hours passed like this, a brutal blur of noise, blood, and unrelenting horror. By dawn, the horde had thinned, but not disappeared. We were exhausted, bloodied, but alive. I looked at Mick, at the man who had saved me once, who had betrayed me once, and I realized something terrifying. Trust wasn't about loyalty. It was about necessity. And in the apocalypse, necessity was the only law that mattered. The horde had thinned, but the damage was done. The base of the tower was scarred, splintered wood jutting like jagged teeth, the traps twisted and broken. I counted the days of supplies left in my head, less than a week. Food was scarce, water running low, and our energy nearly spent. Mick and I moved like ghosts, careful, deliberate, conserving every ounce of strength. Hunger is a strange thing. It gnaws at you, not just in the belly, but in the mind. It sharpens fear, twists thought, and pushes men to act in ways they wouldn't otherwise. I could see it in Mick. His hands shook more, his eyes darted more, and his jokes, the ones he used to tell to lighten the silence, had disappeared. We were not the same men who had climbed into this tower weeks ago. We were survivors, stripped to the bones of ourselves. I realized that survival wasn't just about defending the tower. It was about the world outside, the forest, the remnants of civilization, the rivers and the cabins scattered like broken teeth across the landscape. We needed to venture out. The thought filled me with dread. Every trip outside was a risk of death, either from the infected or from desperate humans who had already shown what they were willing to do. I broached the subject to Mick one night as we sat atop the platform, watching the shadows stretch across the forest floor. "We have to go out," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Supplies won't last. The tower isn't enough anymore." He looked at me, eyes dark under the firelight of our small lantern. "I know," he said, "but it's dangerous. If we get caught, we're done for." "Better to die searching than to die waiting," I replied. The next morning, we prepared. We packed what little food remained, filled every container with water, and armed ourselves with everything we could carry. I strapped my rifle across my back, the sharpened bat hanging from my belt, and Mick carried the small generator we had salvaged, just in case. We descended from the tower with the practiced caution of men who had become something more than human, or less, depending on perspective. The forest greeted us with the usual chorus: groans, whispers, the rustling of leaves. We moved silently, covering each other, listening, watching. The cabin was our first target. I remembered its location from weeks ago, a fragile structure, half collapsed, but possibly holding supplies. As we approached, I noticed the signs, too late footprints in the mud, the smell of smoke. Someone had been here recently. "Stay close," I whispered. Inside, the cabin was stripped clean. No food, no water, not even a scrap of cloth to use for bandages. But I found something worse. Evidence of a fire recently lit. The kind humans light when they're angry, when they're hunting, when they're desperate. "They were here," Mick said quietly. "Someone's been using this place, and they know we're nearby." I felt a cold weight settle in my chest. We weren't alone. We hadn't been alone for weeks. Every human we encountered, every rustle in the underbrush, every shadow at the edge of our vision, they were all threats now. And now, the forest felt less like a refuge and more like a trap. We left quickly, retracing our path back to the tower. But the forest seemed changed. Shadows moved in ways they hadn't before. The wind, carrying whispers I wasn't sure were real. Mick kept close, but even he was jumpy, tripping over roots, flinching at noises. By the time we reached the tower, dusk had fallen. I climbed first, checking the perimeter, counting the groans, scanning for movement. Mick followed. We reinforced the ladder, rechecked the traps, and finally allowed ourselves a brief moment of rest. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at the edge of the platform, watching the moonlight flicker across the treetops, thinking about the humans we had seen, the ones who had tried to burn us out, the ones who had returned and attacked. Survival wasn't just about avoiding death. It was about outthinking other people, outmaneuvering them, and sometimes being willing to do things you never thought you could. Mick spoke after a long silence. "Do you ever think we're losing who we were?" I considered this, who I was, who we had been before the world ended, before the dead rose, before humans became as dangerous as monsters. "Yes," I said, finally. "But surviving is what matters. Everything else is gone." He nodded, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. He wanted to hold on to something human, some trace of the man he had been, but the forest and the tower and the hunger were stripping it away. I understood that. I feared it, too. The next morning, the forest gave me a warning I could not ignore. A figure appeared at the edge of our clearing, moving cautiously, almost reverently. At first, I thought it was another human intruder, another threat. But as it stepped into the light, I realized it was someone I hadn't expected, a young girl, no more than 12 or 13, ragged, filthy, but alive. She froze when she saw us, fear etched across her face. I didn't lower my rifle. Mick stepped beside me, tense, ready. Don't hurt me," she whispered. I studied her, weighing the risk. Children were dangerous in their own way. They attracted attention, slowed you down, and yet she was alone, vulnerable, human, in a way that reminded me of something I had nearly forgotten. "What's your name?" I asked. "Lila," she said, her voice barely audible. I glanced at Mick. He tensed, unsure. Trusting her would complicate things, slow us down, increase risk. But leaving her meant abandoning a human, something I hadn't done before. "Stay quiet, stay close, follow our rules," I said finally. "If you do that, you live." Her eyes filled with tears, relief washing over her small, dirty face. She nodded. Lila's presence changed everything. The tower, once a refuge for two, now became a fragile nest for three. Her small frame made her vulnerable, and every rustle of the forest made her jump. She clung to Mick, asking questions in whispers, needing reassurance that neither of us could give fully. We weren't heroes. We weren't saviors. We were survivors, scraping life from a world that wanted us dead. I watched her closely. Survival had taught me to read people, to measure strength not just in arms or endurance, but in will. Lila had it, in a quiet, stubborn way that reminded me of someone I had once been before everything fell apart. She also slowed us. Every supply run now required extra caution. Every trip to the stream became a risk multiplied. But leaving her wasn't an option. Some instincts are deeper than reason. Days passed with tense monotony. We fortified the tower further, patched the ladder, repaired traps, and set sentries for the night. The forest remained alive with groans and whispers, but humans became the more pressing threat. We spotted them again, the same group who had attacked before. They lurked just beyond the tree line, stalking, observing, calculating. Unlike the undead, they adapted. Unlike the undead, they could plan, deceive, and kill with purpose. One evening, I spotted smoke curling from a distant ridge. I squinted through the binoculars, heart hammering. The humans were building a fire, not cooking, not signaling. They were staging, preparing, and they had a line of sight to the tower. "They're coming," I whispered to Mick. He tightened his grip on his rifle, his jaw set, eyes scanning. Lila clung to his leg, silent, her wide eyes darting between us. We had hours to prepare. Hours to turn our fragile fortress into something unassailable or die trying. I organized the defenses like a general planning for a siege. We had the height advantage, but that meant little if they brought enough firepower. I moved planks to reinforce the platform, strung the remaining tripwire traps around the base, and set improvised alarms. Mick prepared the generator, and some old flares we had salvaged desperate measures to signal, distract, or blind our attackers. Lila helped where she could, carrying supplies, watching for movement, her small hands steady despite the fear etched into her face. Night fell. The first shots came, just as the moon crested the horizon, cold and silver. They were careful, professional, aiming to weaken our defenses without overcommitting. Bullets splintered the railing, ricocheting dangerously close. Mick and I returned fire, picking off the nearest threats. But they were smart. They split into teams, flanking us, moving through the trees like shadows. The forest seemed alive, bending, conspiring with our enemies. I swung the bat at a man who had climbed partway up the ladder, while Mick covered the platform with precise rifle fire. Lila ducked behind a crate, clutching a piece of rope like a lifeline. Hours stretched into chaos. Fire flared as a Molotov hit near the base, flames licking at our barricades. The smell of smoke, blood, and fear filled the tower. I fought not just the humans, but the rising panic, the exhaustion gnawing at my bones. Every shot, every swing, every decision carried the weight of life and death. And then it happened, a scream from the forest. One of the humans had drawn the attention of the horde. The dead surged from the tree line, lured by sound, scent, instinct. Groans filled the air, mingling with gunfire, screams, and the crackle of flames. I realized in that instant that the siege had become worse than we imagined. Not just humans, not just undead, both at once. Survival had never demanded this much. Mick grabbed my arm. "We can't hold them all," he shouted over the noise. I nodded. "We won't. We need to fall back to higher ground." The top platform was all we had left. I ordered Lila and Mick to retreat while I held the lower levels. The climbing was treacherous, every step a gamble. I swung the bat at a human who reached the ladder, catching him and sending him falling into the horde below. The undead didn't hesitate. They swallowed him in seconds. By the time we reached the upper platform, the fire had consumed most of the lower barricades. Smoke choked us, and the heat made the wood groan ominously. I was breathing hard, sweat and soot stinging my eyes, and for the first time, I wondered if we would survive the night. Lila's small voice cut through my panic. "What about them?" "The horde?" I asked, voice hoarse. "Yes. What about the people climbing?" "They'll get what's coming to them," I said flatly, but I didn't mean it in the cruel sense. I meant it as a fact. Survival demanded ruthlessness. Survival demanded decisions that left guilt in their wake. The humans regrouped, trying to find another way up. Mick and I fired, swung, shouted, and improvised. Time became a blur, an endless series of threats pressing from every side. And then, just as exhaustion threatened to overtake me, I noticed something unexpected. The horde was confused, disorganized. The humans had made a critical mistake luring the dead toward the tower, but failing to manage the flow. I saw an opportunity. "Follow my lead!" I shouted to Mick, pointing toward a weakened section of the railing. We rigged a small platform with some of the remaining flares and a rope, using fire and noise to direct the horde toward the human attackers below. The plan was risky, too risky, but necessity had left us no choice. As the humans realized the horde was turning on them, panic spread. Screams, gunfire, and groans collided into a horrifying symphony. One by one, they fell, their careful planning undone by chaos and instinct. The horde swept through, leaving only silence in its wake. We were alive, shaken, exhausted, gasping for breath, but alive. Mick sank to the floor of the platform, hands trembling. Lila curled against him, silent. I sat beside them, rifle still in hand, listening. The forest had quieted. The fire burned low. The horde had moved on, or perhaps it had simply taken what it wanted. The day after the siege, the tower felt like a ghost. Smoke curled from the burned barricades, the wood groaned with stress, and the forest was unnaturally quiet. The horde had thinned, but I knew better than to think they were gone. The humans were dead, or so I assumed, but we had no way of knowing if more would follow. Every shadow, every whisper of wind could be the harbinger of our end. We moved like exhausted phantoms through the upper platform, surveying damage and tallying supplies. The generator we salvaged barely worked, sputtering more than it ran. Food was down to a few cans of beans and the last of the dried meat Mick had scavenged. Water was rationed, and even our flares were running low. Mick sat in the corner, head in his hands, silent. Lila clung to him like a small animal, whispering questions about what had happened, about the people, about the fire and the groans. I didn't have answers. I had rules, calculations, and instincts, but no comfort to offer. "Tomorrow," I said finally, voice hoarse. "We go out. We find supplies. We can't stay here forever." Mick looked up, his eyes red, dark with sleepless nights and the memory of what we had just survived. "I don't know if I can handle another attack," he said quietly. "I don't know if Lila can." "I don't know if I can either," I admitted. "But we have no choice. Hunger kills faster than the dead, and fear can paralyze you faster than bullets." The decision was made. Tomorrow, we would leave the tower to hunt for food, water, and whatever else could keep us alive. That night, I lay awake, listening to the wind in the treetops, thinking about the choices that had brought us here. Every decision had consequences, some visible, some hidden. Trust, once a luxury, was now a tool of survival. I had trusted Mick, despite his earlier hesitation and potential betrayal. I had trusted the girl, despite the risks. And each time, I had lived to see another day. But trust has a limit, and necessity has a way of pushing people past it. Morning came like a blade of cold light. We packed quickly, moving in, practiced silence. Mick carried the last of the flares. Lila held a small knife I had fashioned for her safety. I slung my rifle across my back, bat at my side, and led the way down the ladder. The forest greeted us like an old enemy and unpredictable. Every step required vigilance. Every rustle could be a threat. We reached the stream without incident. The water was clear, but low. We filled every container, rationing it carefully. As I knelt to test the depth, I saw movement, human movement, cautious, hidden behind the trees. "They're scouting," I whispered, nodding toward the line of figures. 4 humans, armed, moving in careful coordination. Mick froze. Lila's eyes went wide. I had no time for hesitation. "Back to the tower," I hissed. "Now." We retraced our steps, moving silently, but one of the humans saw us. A rifle cracked. The shot hit the ground near Mick's feet, splintering the soil. He ducked instinctively, dragging Lila behind him. I returned fire, and chaos erupted. The humans were more organized than the last group. They weren't desperate. They were calculating. They flanked us, moving with precision, forcing us to retreat back into the open clearing. I made a decision that I hadn't considered before. We couldn't survive in the forest. The tower was our only advantage. I shouted for Mick and Lila to run toward it while I covered the rear, firing at the approaching humans and drawing their attention. Every step was agony. My lungs burned. My arms shook, but I couldn't stop. One of them lunged at me with a knife, and I swung the bat, catching him across the chest and sending him sprawling. The others were closing in, and I knew my time was limited. We reached the tower, panting, bruised, bleeding but alive. The humans had not pursued further, likely deterred by the traps and the looming horde in the forest beyond. For now, we were safe. But safety was a fragile illusion. Over the next few days, tension between Mick and me began to crack the fragile unity we had built. He was braver, more assertive than before, taking risks I wouldn't have considered. Lila admired him, trusted him implicitly, and I began to feel the subtle strain of authority slipping from my hands. One evening, as we patched another breach in the platform, I confronted him. "You're taking too many risks," I said, voice low. "We survive by caution, not bravado." Mick's eyes flared. "You're scared," he snapped. "I'm trying to keep us alive. I'm trying to get us more than scraps and fear." I'm keeping us alive, I said firmly, not risking it all, on instinct and luck. The argument ended in silence, but the tension lingered. Survival was testing not just our bodies, but our minds, our trust, and our fragile sense of morality. Then came the morning of the storm. Heavy clouds rolled in, wind howling through the forest, lightning flashing over the treetops. The horde was restless, drawn to sound, movement, and scent. The humans, or whoever had been tracking us, could strike at any moment. We reinforced the tower again, stacking what little we had to protect against the wind and the rain. Mick worked with quiet efficiency, Lila helping where she could. I watched them, thinking about the fragility of our existence. One misstep, one misjudgment, and it would all be over. Night fell, and with it came the first wave. The wind carried groans and the distant echo of movement through the trees. The horde pressed close to the tower, and somewhere in the forest, humans waited, watching, calculating. The storm battered the platform, making it slippery, dangerous, and unpredictable. Lila screamed as a branch broke near her, Mick catching her just in time. Hours stretched into eternity. We were exhausted, bloodied, and drenched, but we survived. The storm passed, leaving silence in its wake. I sat atop the platform, rifle in hand, Lila clinging to Mick, and realized something terrifying. We had survived everything so far: the horde, the humans, the fire, the storm. And yet, every victory brought us closer to the edge of exhaustion, closer to the point where one mistake could end it all. The days that followed the storm were a slow, grinding test of endurance. The forest had turned into a maze of mud and fallen branches, the streams overflowing, and the wind still howled as if mourning the world's collapse. The tower, our refuge, creaked and moaned with every gust. We moved like shadows, careful with each step, each breath, each movement. Supplies were almost gone. The last of the beans and dried meat had been rationed over the past week, and the water supply was half what it had been. Lila's stomach growled constantly, and every night I saw the worry in Mick's eyes. Hunger made people unpredictable. It twisted the mind, made decisions sharper or more desperate. And I had begun to notice subtle changes in Mick: impatience, daring risks, the edge of frustration that had been buried beneath fear before. I reminded myself constantly, we needed him. But trust, once fractured, is difficult to mend. I had seen it before: people make choices in desperation that will change the rest of their lives or end them entirely. That night, I set up watch as usual. Mick and Lila rested, trying to sleep despite the groans of the distant horde. From my perch, I could see movement in the tree-line humans. Not the same group as before, I realized, with a knot in my stomach. These were larger, organized, armed. They weren't scavengers, they were predators, and they were coming for us. I roused Mick quietly, and we made a quick plan. This time, we couldn't just defend. We had to be proactive, to take control of the first strike. We hit them while they set up, I whispered, quietly, lethally. Mick hesitated. Are you sure? There are a lot of them. I'm sure, I said. We don't survive waiting. We gathered our weapons, rifles, knives, bats, and the last of our flares. Lila clutched a small knife I had fashioned for her, her fingers white around the hilt. I knelt beside her. Stay behind us. Do exactly what we tell you. No heroics. Understand? She nodded, eyes wide but determined. I glanced at Mick, reading the tension in his jaw. We move fast. We take out their perimeter. No mistakes. And then we descended from the tower, the forest cold and wet around us, the wind carrying the distant groans of both the undead and the humans. We moved silently, creeping along the underbrush toward the human encampment. I could see them now, torches flickering, rifles leaning against makeshift barricades, shadows moving methodically. They hadn't noticed us yet. I signaled to Mick, and we split into two paths, flanking the perimeter. Lila stayed with me, silent and tense. I felt her trembling, but she didn't complain, didn't cry. She was small but fierce in her own way, and I couldn't afford to underestimate her courage. The first target was a sentry near the edge of the camp. I took careful aim, fired, and the man dropped silently into the mud. Mick dispatched another, and within minutes, 2 guards were down, the rest unaware. Then the alarms went off. A torch had been knocked over. The human camp erupted in chaos, shouts mixing with gunfire, metal clanging, and the distant groans of the horde now drawn by sound. "Move!" I shouted. Mick and I fought our way through, Lila close behind, as humans fell before us and undead flooded the edges of the camp. The plan had been to thin their numbers, not engage directly, but circumstances had forced our hand. We reached the center of the encampment, taking cover behind crates and makeshift barricades. Mick fired. Lila stayed behind us, throwing small flares to distract and disorient. It was chaos, mud, blood, sweat, fire, groans, screams. Every second stretched into eternity. Hours later, when the dust had settled, the camp lay in ruin. The surviving humans fled into the forest, some not realizing they were being followed by the horde we had inadvertently unleashed. The dead didn't discriminate. We were soaked, bruised, battered, and reeking of smoke and blood, but we were alive. We made our way back to the tower as dawn broke, the forest eerily quiet, the horde's distant groans receding. I counted the cost: injuries, near misses, exhaustion, and the lingering fear that tomorrow would bring something worse. At the tower, we collapsed inside, tending to wounds, reinforcing weak points, and finally allowing ourselves a moment to breathe. Lila curled against Mick, quiet at last, and I sat on the platform, rifle across my lap, staring at the horizon. Days passed. The forest remained tense, alive with potential threats, but the tower held. Mick and I worked together more efficiently now, despite our earlier fractures. Trust, fragile and tested, had strengthened in the fire of survival. Then came the night that would change everything. The horde returned, larger than before, faster, more coordinated. I had never seen anything like it. They surrounded the tower, groaning and shrieking, filling the clearing with their relentless presence. I estimated hundreds too many to fight head-on. The humans had likely fled earlier, but now the forest itself seemed to rise against us. I barked orders to Mick and Lila. Traps were armed, flares ready, every barricade reinforced. We had prepared as best we could, but instinct told me it wasn't enough. Survival demanded a decision: stand and fight, or risk everything to escape. We fought. The platform shuddered under the weight of panic, the railing splintering with each impact. Lila screamed as a branch broke near her, Mick catching her just in time. The horde pressed harder. I realized, in a moment of grim clarity, that the tower could not hold indefinitely. The choice was clear. We had to leave. I grabbed Mick and Lila. "Now!" I shouted. "We run!" We descended the ladder, flames and groans surrounding us. The forest became a blur of mud, blood, and desperate motion. Shots rang out, bodies fell, and I swung the bat at an undead hand that reached for me. Lila screamed but ran, her small frame moving faster than I thought possible. We emerged into the dense woods, the tower disappearing behind us in smoke and shadow. Smoke still drifted in the distance, the charred remnants standing like a blackened monument to survival. Mick ran beside me, Lila clinging to his arm, her small body shaking but determined. We were alive, but only barely. Every step carried the weight of exhaustion. Every breath was a battle. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say. Words were luxury. Survival demanded silence, awareness, and relentless forward motion. We moved deeper into the forest, guided by instinct, the occasional scraps of memory, and the faint hope that somewhere beyond the trees lay water, food, and safety. But safety, I knew, was an illusion. The world outside the tower was filled with threats, both human and undead. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves could be the end. By midday, hunger and fatigue gnawed at us. Lila's small hand gripped Mick's arm like a lifeline, and I carried the last of our water in a small canteen, rationing it carefully. My mind calculated every step, every choice, every risk. "We can't stop," I said finally, voice low, hoarse. "If we stop, we die. Keep moving." Mick nodded, though I could see the strain in his eyes. "I know," he said quietly. Lila didn't speak. We stumbled across a clearing, and I froze. Ahead of us lay what appeared to be the remnants of a small settlement. Shattered walls, burnt-out vehicles, and the stench of decay filled the air. But beyond that, something caught my attention. Smoke, a signal, a fire, small and controlled, rising from a distant ridge. "Someone's alive," I whispered. Mick tensed beside me. Could be friendly, could be dangerous, could be human, or worse. Lila's voice broke the tension. "We should go," she said simply. "Please." I nodded. Instinct told me it was worth the risk. We approached cautiously, keeping low, scanning the perimeter for signs of life. As we drew closer, the smoke resolved into a small, fortified camp. People moved within the walls, humans, alive, and seemingly organized. I signaled Mick. We approached carefully. We stepped into the clearing, hands raised, weapons visible but lowered. The humans inside froze, rifles trained on us instantly. "Who are you?" a voice called, harsh, suspicious. I stepped forward. "We're survivors. We mean no harm. We're just trying to survive." A woman stepped forward, rifle in hand, eyes sharp. "Survivors, huh?" She scanned us quickly, taking in Lila, the blood on our clothes, the exhaustion etched into our faces. "We've had enough of strangers. Step back." I raised my hands higher. "Please, we have a child with us. We don't want trouble. We just need food, water, shelter, safety." For a tense moment, nothing moved. Then the woman lowered her rifle slightly. "Child?" she asked, voice softer. Lila stepped forward, hesitant but steady. The woman's eyes softened just a fraction. "All right," she said finally. "Follow me, but any wrong move, and you're out. Understood?" I nodded, relief mingling with caution. Mick did the same. Lila clung to me for just a moment before following the woman. Inside the camp, we were given food and water for the first time in days. Simple, hot broth, and bread that felt like luxury in our emaciated state. We ate in silence, each of us lost in thought. The woman, who introduced herself as Mara, observed us carefully, her eyes wary but not hostile. "You're lucky," she said finally. "Most people who wander these woods don't make it this far." Over the next few days, we integrated into the camp. Mara's people were cautious but disciplined, and survival here required cooperation. We shared our knowledge of traps, patrols, and tactics. Mick became more confident, more certain, shedding the last vestiges of fear that had haunted him since the tower. Lila, small but resilient, adapted quickly, learning the routines and observing the older survivors with quiet attention. And I felt a strange mixture of relief and unease. Relief that we had survived, found shelter, and were no longer alone. Unease because the world was still broken, unpredictable, and dangerous. Then came the final warning. One night, scouts returned, faces pale, eyes wide with terror. "The horde," they whispered. "Massive, heading this way." I felt the old adrenaline surge. Mara called a council. Weapons were distributed, barricades reinforced, traps doubled. Every able-bodied survivor prepared to fight or flee. I looked at Mick and Lila. "We've done everything we can," I said. "Whatever happens, we survive, together, no matter what." Lila nodded, her small hand gripping mine. Mick's jaw set, eyes hard with determination. The attack came at dawn. Hundreds of undead swarmed the camp, groaning and shrieking, relentless in their pursuit of life. Mara's people fought valiantly, holding choke points, using fire, noise, and ingenuity to thin the numbers. Mick and I worked side by side, covering Lila, picking off threats, improvising, surviving. Bodies fell, both living and dead. Fire burned through barricades, and the forest itself seemed alive, twisting, writhing, conspiring with the horde. Mick fought like a man possessed, each shot precise, each swing decisive. Lila remained behind us, throwing rocks and flares to distract the dead, following orders with determination I could hardly believe. And then, amidst the chaos, I saw a path, an open ridge leading away from the forest, a narrow route to higher ground, and perhaps safety. "Go!" I shouted to Mick and Lila. "This way!" We ran, dodging undead, leaping over fallen branches, slipping in mud and blood, driven by sheer will. We reached the ridge, lungs burning, muscles screaming, and looked back. The camp was overrun. Flames consumed barricades. The horde had taken everything, but we were alive. Lila stumbled, but didn't fall. Mick caught her, steadying her small frame. I looked at them, at the two people who had become my family in this broken world. We continued onward, leaving the forest behind, the smoke of the tower and the camp fading into the distance. We didn't speak. There was no celebration, no relief. And as the sun rose over the ridge, lighting the world in pale gold, I understood something fundamental. We were not safe, but we were alive. That, for now, was enough.